Organizing, structure, and leadership. How do you enhance those? That's what we heard about from Kevin today, and he really had some very practical tips on each of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin is the co-founder of Ascent Management Consulting, a business Rich he started 25 years ago and has stayed with it through this whole journey. So he's seen the evolution of business, the evolution of leadership over the past 25 years, and he currently runs a 90-day turnaround program, 90dayturnaround.com. It has a great program for leaders really wanting to dive deeper in their business and see what's going on. So let's jump right into this episode with Kevin Herring. Kevin, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast. As we were talking about just a few minutes ago, you've been with your company, Ascent Management Consulting, for 25 years, helping leaders and companies turn around and head in the right direction. Love to learn a little bit more about what Ascent does. But before we do that, bring us back, way back to when you decided, I'm going to start a management consulting company. And here 25 years later, you're still running that same company. What was going on at that time in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this will point out how naive I was about starting a consulting business. But throughout my life as a youth, I had all kinds of jobs like a lot of people did, and I've always gravitated toward those that gave me a lot of autonomy. I love to be able to have the freedom to kind of do my own thing and get the job done the way I like to do it. And as I got closer to college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I definitely had an interest in business, but I wanted to work with people, and I kept thinking of how businesses run. That was sort of an interest that I had, and I had I think what sparked it was early in my college career, I had a summer job where I worked for a company called Harvest Made. I don't know if you're familiar with those round-shaped dehydrators, food dehydrators.
Okay.
But it was a great job, assembly line, about as exciting as it gets, right?
Yeah.
So I had this job, and I stumbled into a sort of accidental self-directed work team. No manager on site, we just people on the line just sort of ran it, and we set new goals every week and just on our own and reached them. And I don't think anybody even noticed, but it was a great experience. And then at the end of the summer, they brought in somebody to kind of run it and improve performance, ironically, and immediately shut down a lot of the things that we were doing that made us successful. And that sort of sparked something in me. I could see the stark contrast between what we had and what he created. And it was a short time. He ran the place into the ground. Interesting. Yeah. I ended up bumping into a lot of those same people at another place that I worked who sort of fled the place after I went back to school. But great experience. And when I got into college, I discovered a field called organizational behavior. It was a new field at the time. You could get a graduate degree in it. And it sounded kind of like what I wanted, but I wanted business classes. And so I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Illinois. And while I was there, I was in the organizational behavior program, but most of my classes were over in the business school.
Yep.
And I got chastised for that by the assistant dean. But yeah, it was okay. It was great. And I had a professor who did a lot of consulting and actually taught classes in consulting and creating consulting models and business models. And we actually did a consulting project with a healthcare organization there in town. You're familiar with the Carl Clinics at the time. We actually, hospital and clinics, we went in and did a consulting project. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. That's where I wanted to end up.
Okay, awesome. And, there's a couple of pieces there right off the bat that really intrigued me. Number one is you knew very early that if you wanted autonomy, you probably should do your own thing.
Yeah.
And, this is the Entrepreneurs United podcast, not the, go be a number taker at a job somewhere. I mean, we either have entrepreneurs that really want to make a difference and make an impact on an organization here. So that fits right into what we do. And the other part of it too, I'm curious to kind of dig into a little bit is, you had an experience where some expert from out of town, who they call a consultant, came in and tried to tell you how to do your job better.
Right.
And it kind of turned upside down all the things that you guys knew inherently would help you guys do your job
Hmm.
right. And now you're that guy
Right.
that
Right.
sometimes
I'm
is
that
going
guy.
into companies, right? And
Hmm.
you're trying to help them turn around, and the employees are probably there going, "Hey, you're some expert from out of town. How does this work? How do you approach it differently than maybe that consultant did at the assembly line job? To make sure that you get the most impact out of the teams you're working with."
Yeah, that's a great question. I always look at those in the organization as having the most expertise about the product, about what works, what doesn't, about the customer. They're closest to the work, they're closest to the customer. That expertise is there. I have a lot of expertise around organizing and structuring and leadership and those kinds of things to help enhance and enhance their work and create opportunities for them to better produce, to better do the things, apply the expertise, the knowledge that they already have. And the funny thing is, when I go into organizations, quite often I'll have people come up to me when I'm working with large groups of people in an organization, the employees, the line workers, and they'll come up to me afterwards and say, some of the things you're talking about that you've learned through your analysis of our organization, I've been saying for years, and nobody ever listened to me. And now the leaders are listening to me. And I said, you're exactly right. I hear that all the time
Yeah.
because this stuff. I don't come up with something new all the time. I mean, you guys are already working with this, and you understand this, but you don't get a hearing, right? You're not heard in your organization. I can give what you understand. I can give that voice in your organization, and I can help your leaders understand how they need to listen to you more so
Mm,
that they can take advantage of the expertise that you bring to the organization. So
yeah.
absolutely, I work with what they bring and the knowledge that they've attained doing the work already.
Kevin, I love that. Before you said the word voice, I wrote down voice
Mhm.
on my thing because that's what I was hearing from you. And some of this is maybe a weakness of some leaders, right? Which is a lot of leaders, entrepreneurs specifically, have done the job of the people that now report to them. So
Yep.
they know best. I did this job. I know how this
Hmm.
is supposed to be. But things change. Technology change. Human nature changes. The product services change. Things
Exactly.
change. And what the entrepreneur may have a blind eye to, the employee's like, I've been trying to tell you for 3 years now, this is not the best way to do this anymore. You just won't listen. But all of a sudden, the entrepreneur hires Ascent. You come in, talk to the employees, get all of their feedback, and help
Hmm.
them help them have a voice within the organization. Is that a good
Yeah,
recap?
absolutely, absolutely. And I'll say also leaders often will bring me in and say, I need you to kind of fix the people, fix the group.
Yeah.
And and I always tell them, look, I never know what I'm going to find out when I get into the organization.
Mhm.
I may find out that you're doing some things that are contributing to the problem. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things I want to make sure we have an understanding that I'm going to raise those difficult issues with you, and I want you to be prepared for that. And they often squirm and well, I'm not the problem, and but it's, well, I don't know, maybe you're not, but I go in with a blank slate. I don't have any assumptions here.
Yeah. No,
The
I
other
love
thing,
that.
right? The other thing is that they often send me out to sort of fix things, and I tell them, look, one of the things that we're going to find is that people have a lot of understanding of the organization, and we need to tap that. And they'll say, well, you only need to talk to me. You don't need to talk to them because I've already done that job, just like you're saying. I've already been there. I worked through the organization, did all those jobs. I have an understanding of it. And I say just what you said. Um, you may have, and I don't doubt that. But when was the last time you were down there doing that job?
Yeah.
Right? Things change all the time, and I'll give you a good example. I have often used this with clients and said, look, you might say today that quality is number one. We don't ship anything out that's not up to our standards. And but I'll go down and talk to the people down there at the shipping dock, and they'll tell me what happens at the end of the month, the last Friday of the month, when it's an hour before closing, and they're throwing stuff on the truck,
Yeah.
that hasn't passed quality inspections just to get it out the door and meet the numbers for the month. I said, you won't tell me that. You may not even know it's happening, but they'll tell me that. That's why I need to get down and talk to the folks because they know what's really going on.
Question for you, Kevin.
Yeah.
If you become the voice that already existed, that leaders then will listen to, why? Why do leaders require to hire somebody else to amplify a voice of their own people? What is it that leaders are not getting that requires you?
Yeah, great point. So there are a couple of things. One is that leaders often don't recognize in themselves that they have a stance about the people that work for them, and that stance may be that they inherently um, distrust people. They don't feel like they're competent or capable or dependable. That somehow they have to kind of be the watchman, the watcher to make sure they're getting things done, that they're taking care of business. And if they don't watch them, if they're not making all the decisions, they're not managing them closely, that things just don't happen like they should. And then there's others. There are other leaders who have the opposite stance about people. That people are inherently dependable. That they generally want to do a good job, and you don't have to watch them. Give them the freedom, the latitude to make decisions about how to do the work and all that, and they'll take care of business as they should. That makes a huge impact on how leaders treat people, how they work with them. And if they don't trust them inherently, they tend to not listen to them. They tend to not see value in what they bring to the organization. And they tend to feel that employees are basically an extension of them, a pair of hands, basically, where they're the head, the people are the hands, and so they don't give them a voice. They don't really respect that they have expertise, knowledge, understanding that they could bring to bear on the organization. And I'll tell you, one of the problems with that is that when we hire people just for their hands, or just for even for the expertise they have, like an accountant, let's say, we fragment the company. We break it apart because we tell everybody we're hiring them to do a specific set of tasks instead of hiring them to be another business person who is accountable for the success of the whole business. To start thinking and acting like a business person, not an accountant that happens to be working there, not an IT person who happens to be working there, or a widget maker who just happens to be at XYZ company, right? We can't do that if we're micromanaging people and we're thinking of them as a pair of hands. We have to think differently. We have to have a different stance. And if we don't have that different stance, that's one of the things that I do is I help challenge them and I confront that and tell them, look, if you're not ready to do that, you're never going to be a great leader. You're never going to get employees engaged. You're never going to get the kind of performance you want in your organization. If you want that, and you're finding that very difficult to accept, then you're going to have that new stance. If you find that difficult to accept, then maybe you're going to have to take a leap of faith. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Are you willing to take a leap of faith and try it out and do the things that I teach you here and give you a chance to realize some of the results so that you understand that it does work, that it makes a difference?
So when you had said that sometimes leaders have a stance that they aren't aware of, to what role does emotional intelligence or lack thereof play?
Well, awareness is a huge piece of it, right? Emotional intelligence. We ask people to have an awareness of how they come across to others, how they treat others, how they work with others, and be aware of their own internal experiences. In other words, what's going on inside of you when X happens? What does that do for you? And then how do you respond in the moment? How do you deal with people? We really try to help people to understand and learn themselves well enough to have that awareness, so they can see how they're impacting others and the organization as a whole. That's a critical piece of it. And I remember when, and this goes back quite a while, but when Goldman came up with this whole theory about emotional intelligence and started doing the research and writing the books, he talked about that as being probably the most critical thing for a leader to have. That above anything else, it's harder to teach that. It's harder to learn that. That by a certain age in adulthood, and we're not talking 50 or 60, we're talking, in your 20s, 30s, if you don't have a certain level of emotional intelligence, it's going to be really hard for a person to develop and be the kind of leader they need to be.
I'm wondering on this one, Kevin, in my experience, speaking personally, when I've been a leader and I feel like maybe I've had the blind spots in retrospect to what was actually going on, maybe it is emotional intelligence, but for me, it was a lack of vulnerability. I thought I really knew. I really believed I knew, and I would hear my people say what they were saying. I'm like, no, like I really, and part of it was I didn't want to be wrong deep down. I thought that I really had this licked, but I really didn't. And it was me not wanting to be vulnerable and weak in the moment to go, oh, I really don't know what's going on in my business. Is that a part of emotional intelligence, or is that a little bit different?
No, it is. It absolutely is. And I would say that the vast majority of leaders struggle with control and vulnerability as their two most difficult things to overcome. When someone like me, a consultant, comes into the organization, that's what they're threatened with. They don't want me to know their concerns, their issues, their weaknesses. They don't want their employees to know what their weaknesses are. And the funniest thing that we all experience is we know some of our weaknesses. We don't know all of them. We have those blind spots, but sometimes we're well aware of them. And the reality is they're so obvious, they're so glaringly obvious that our employees are well aware of them. But we don't want to know that our employees know, even though it's obvious to everybody, right? The emperor has no clothes. It's obvious to everybody. But as the emperor, I don't want to hear from the people that they're aware, even though it's glaringly obvious. It's just a funny thing about us. But that's one of the biggest challenges as a consultant, is to go into an organization and work with a leader and deal with those kinds of vulnerabilities. Those concerns that they have about being exposed. And so we have to say, look, we have to get the things, we have to get this out on the table. And I'm going to bring up things that may be hard for you to accept, but you also need to be aware that your employees can bring those things to you if you make it safe for them to do it. The worst thing you have is leaders who simply will not hear bad news or challenges to authority or challenges to their decisions, right? Because people stop giving them. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen organizations just heading toward a train wreck simply because the leader wouldn't accept the knowledge or the information that things aren't going well, and so people didn't want to tell them. Wouldn't state the obvious.
Kevin, I've got 4 daughters, and I know I always win their heart when I say. So I was watching a TikTok and they love me when whatever I say next, it doesn't matter. I was watching a TikTok, Kevin, and I hope I get your heart by saying this. That a guy was talking about what you're talking about, where you have low self-awareness, but everybody else knows. And he talked about you could have the worst smelling breath and your mouth is right under your nose. And you could have the worst smelling breath and somehow you don't know it, but everybody else in the room does. Nobody wants to talk about it with you because it's a little bit embarrassing. And he described that as the human experience. Is you can't smell what's right under your nose, but everybody else can. And the challenge is engaging others so that they're comfortable talking about that with us. Right. And I think that is so accurate and so important to be able to do. We had another podcast guest named Ryan Godfredson, and he talked about the higher up you go in leadership, typically the less emotional intelligence you're going to have over time, because there are less and less people who are willing to tell you where your blind spots are, versus when you first start off in the work, everybody wants to tell you what to
Right.
do and what you're doing wrong. And as you ascend leadership, nobody does. I'm curious to dig into this. When you hire for tasks, it becomes a fragmented business
Hmm.
versus hiring business owners of whatever their responsibility is. What are some telltale signs that our listeners or John and I may be able to identify with as to whether we are hiring for tasks or we're hiring business owners? What are the telltale signs to know which one you're doing?
Well, I will say, I want to preface this by saying that most people don't work in an environment where they're asked to be business people. And so, most of them are working in a place where they're hired to do tasks, and so they're not even oriented that way. So it doesn't mean they wouldn't be a good fit for your organization. It just means you have to tap that expertise that they haven't tapped themselves. And so you do that when in your interviews. I think you can draw it out of resumes, but mostly it's in interviews. You've got to be able to sit down and ask them how they would handle particular situations. If they had responsibility, a big responsibility for something where they were ultimately accountable for the overall result, or maybe they were working on a team and they weren't the person leading the team, but they could see that the team wasn't going the right direction. They were missing some important things. What did they do? How did they respond? How did they raise those issues? Or did they raise those issues, right? And you're trying to find out how they show leadership when they're not a formal leader. How do they take what they know and apply it to the organization in the interest of making things better for the whole? Do they do that when given the chance, right? Obviously, if you're in an organization that's a fear-based, intimidating kind of organization, it's going to be hard for anybody to operate that way. But if they're given the opportunity and you can kind of see how they respond to it, or if you can draw out their desires to do that, even when they're not in that situation, I think that's how you see how well a fit they are for an organization where you really want people to act in the interest of the larger group, not just to come in and perform a set of tasks that are carefully defined in a job description.
You said that you raise difficult issues with leaders. Can you give us an example of, I don't know, 3 to 5 questions that all leaders should probably ask themselves and could ask themselves, but they often don't, that would raise a difficult issue and some self-awareness about it? What would 3 to 5 questions be that every leader should probably really check in on?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say one of the things I would ask any leader is, if we hear sometimes about these skip level meetings where employees can come in and speak to somebody who's a step above the person they directly report to, right? And they can be open and share concerns and that sort of thing. How often do those things occur that employees sit there and do nothing, say nothing? You can hear crickets in a room because of the fear. They don't dare say anything negative about their boss. So one of the things I ask a leader is, how safe do you make it, or how safe do your direct reports feel raising questions and concerns? How often does that happen? Because if they don't, if it doesn't happen very often, then there's an element of fear. You talked about how in a hierarchy, the higher you go up, the more intimidated people feel, the less likely they are to raise difficult issues. But in a good organization, that's not a problem. Good leadership will enable that and encourage it. And so I always ask that: how safe are people? How often do they challenge you? If you make a decision, what happens? And you announce it in a room full of people. What happens in the meeting and outside of the meeting? Do people raise their concerns in the meeting and have a discussion with you, or do they all nod their heads like a bobblehead and after the meeting's over go into the bathroom and talk about what's really on their minds? And I can tell you how many people can relate to that experience. It's very prevalent. So I ask them, if there's a if there's a problem, are you willing to raise that issue? Are you willing to bring it up with your peers or the next level up? How often do you do that? And what prevents you from doing that? What holds you back? And
So
sometimes
hypothetically, we have a company-wide meeting, and we talk about where we're headed next and some things that need to be done and some responsibilities, and there are some changes that we're going to make, and there aren't any challenges or concerns. How do I know that it's either we have alignment with where we're going, and boy, I just really cast a great vision and my people are with me, versus, oh, nobody's challenging anything. Maybe it's a terrible environment.
Yeah, I mean, when I go into any organization, if people tell me everything's great, I know there's a problem, a big problem, because no organization has everything great. Every organization has its challenges. So I know, so I should know that as a leader. If I announce some big change and there's silence, where everybody again just nods their heads up and down, I know there's a problem. And I think that's a sure sign that I need to ask people, okay, I want to hear what argues against this. If you were in my shoes and you were making the decision, I want to hear what would, if, or say you were in an opposing organization, a competitive organization, what would you be saying about this decision? What challenge this? Tell me what's wrong with it. I want, and if people don't want to speak up, then obviously I know there's a problem, but I'm going to push them. I'm going to say, no, I want to hear it. You tell me. I'm going to point people out. I'm going to say, every one of you, I want you to come up with a different challenge to this decision. Tell me what's wrong with it. Argue with it. I don't care if you agree or disagree. I just want you to argue it. And that's the kind of organization I like to create. Get people challenging the status quo, and that will raise issues that maybe they hadn't even thought of, just in the course of doing that.
I think one of the things too, Kevin, that you talk about here as an example, and kind of again comes back to emotional intelligence, and I've done this before. Make a big change or a big decision in a vacuum. Maybe I talked to a board member or a mentor. Maybe I threw it by my wife. Maybe I threw it by Rich, but I didn't talk to some key stakeholders that this was going to affect. Then I came in on Monday morning. Okay, done. We're painting the walls blue, right? This is what we're doing. And because I was so excited to get it going because I knew it was right. And one of the things, Rich, I don't know if you recall, and I'll go back to hockey, Kevin. We talked a little bit of hockey before coming on. We had one of my favorite hockey players of all time, Ryan Walter, who was a business consultant, played for the Montreal Canadiens for many, many years. And we talked about how it's so important for entrepreneurs to have a trust circle of people in the organization that have their ears to the ground. They're in the bathroom. They're at the water cooler. That you bring into these types of conversations and decisions that they are on board for, so that when you do launch something, it's good for them to be out there and going, no, I support this. This makes a lot of sense when they're talking about it in the bathroom, and or they're going, ooh, maybe we didn't think about that. I should bring that back to Kevin because he needs to know what's going on. And to have those influencers and ears that also know that in a safe environment, they can come report back to you, hey, this isn't going well, John or Kevin or Rich, right?
Yeah.
Think about this. And I thought that was a really genius way of surrounding yourself with that trust circle.
Sure. And to add to that, I wrote an article on this return to work issue, right? A lot of people return to the office issue, where, Apple actually has an organized mutiny kind of going on that they're dealing with. And it's kind of funny because people hate having things done to them, right? We all hate having things done to us. We like to have some semblance of control. I mean, even simple things like riding in the car. A lot of people hate being the passenger. They like to be behind the wheel because of that sense of control. And it doesn't mean you're a control freak. It's just human nature. We don't like things being done to us. And so when we make those big announcements, that's what happens quite often, right? We just tell, okay, here's what's going to be done to you. We hope you're all happy about it. Anybody unhappy? Let's talk about that. It doesn't work. What's better is to solicit information from people before you even do it, if that's possible. It's not always possible, I realize, but to solicit that kind of information, and as much as possible, even if the decision is out of the employee's hands, it's just something that has to be made at the senior level. Then at least involve people in the implementation, so they have some control. So they're co-creators of the change as opposed to the target of the change.
Yeah.
Right.
So I want to bring this full circle in my own head, and hopefully you guys can follow along my thought process here, because it's something we've talked about a little bit on this episode before, but you put it in a different light for me. Don't hire for tasks, hire a business person. And if they're coming to an organization where they feel the purpose of what they're trying to achieve, they'll perform at a higher level. And I'll give you a really good example. My wife just took a job with a charity, and when she went to interview, we're like, yeah, here's kind of the primary role we need you for, but kind of it's all hands on deck here because we're a small group. It's for a charity, so you need to deposit checks. We need you to deposit checks, right? You're here to help us move forward the mission, the purpose, and she's bought into it. Where she'll do anything. She'll go to the charity events and run those, or like that. She's not there to beat this X task.
Right.
It's a purpose. The second one that you talked about is that, most people do not want to work or are not working at a place where they can just have a business purpose of what they really feel like contribute to the organization. And Rich, we had Jeff Cohen on one of our episodes. He wrote a book, Kevin, called Count Onable. When you work for an organization, you can count on me to do these things in this organization. I love doing them. I can be the best in the world at it. This is what you can count on me to do, right? And I love that approach, because if you bring people to your organization that has purpose, so they're not task oriented, they can come do, but their main priority is what they're the best in the world at and what we can count them on. That's number two. And the third one is this concept of being an entrepreneur and making them feel like they have a piece of the organization somehow, some way, which is a new one, because it needs to also drive their economic engine. They need to be able to see how they can progress financially and be rewarded in some way, shape, or form by the role. And if you take those three components, the Venn diagram that I subscribe to of success is what is something you could do that has purpose, that you can be the best in the world at, that can drive your economic engine. Those three concepts are fully at play in everything that you're talking about here today.
I think so. Absolutely. Because if people have meaning and purpose and they're engaged in creating something bigger than themselves, right? They get outside themselves, and now we're creating something that we couldn't possibly do as an individual. It's exciting, it's exhilarating, and it pushes that envelope a little bit to broaden our sense of meaning and purpose when we go to work each day. And it does, work doesn't have to be the end all for our lives, and probably shouldn't be for the most part, but it should be a place where you go and you feel a sense of accomplishment when you leave at the end of the day, something that you're happy that you contributed to, and you feel good about. And if you can engage people in that way and enable them to choose accountability as opposed to being held accountable, right? They choose accountability, choose commitment for the success of the whole. They're going to engage at a much higher level. And as a result, they're going to produce a whole lot more, and the team's going to produce a whole lot more. Yeah. No question about it. I think that Venn diagram of yours is a great kind of encapsulation of those concepts.
How do you work with people that choose accountability? Because you juxtapose choose accountability versus held accountable. And there are a bunch of people that are like, well, I know how to hold people accountable. Sure. Kevin, did you do the thing? Why not? How would one work with you to equip you to choose accountability?
So you create the conditions. So great question. There's an argument that it isn't even possible to hold somebody accountable, in a sense, that everybody has control over their own decision making, their own reaction, their own response to things. But nevertheless, let's talk about how that choosing accountability works. So as a leader, I have the greatest influence over the conditions that people work in, by far, right? By far. And we know, and there's plenty of research on this now too, that shows that the biggest cause of employee demotivation is the frustration, the lack of fulfilled expectations, and those kinds of things that employees have on the job. So again, leader has the influence over that. So the leader can create conditions that enable people to choose by simply providing opportunities for them to make decisions, giving them latitude, transferring expertise and building expertise in the work and in the business overall. I talk a lot about how we look at sports, and I use the football analogy that, and this applies to any sport, hockey or otherwise. You put people out in a team sport. You put them out on the court, on the field, or whatever, and there's a lot of knowledge that they go into that game with. They have a game plan. They have teams with standings, and they know the statistics about the teams, what their strengths and weaknesses are. They know what their own team's strengths and weaknesses are, and they have individual statistics and all that sort of thing. They go in, they have a scoreboard, so they know how they're progressing in the game. There are indicators in the game, goals, goal lines, football lines on the field, and so on, so they can see if they're progressing or not. We send people into these sports arenas with well-equipped for what's about to happen, and to be able to make the right decisions, to choose accountability for the success of the game. So if a ball gets fumbled in a football game, people aren't just standing around wondering if the running back's going to pick it up. right? They know what to do. They're a business person. They got the big picture. They know what needs to happen. They pick it up. They run with it, or they pounce on it and cover it. They know what needs to be done, and they act accordingly. Right? Leaders can create that kind of environment, but we send people into the business world every day without any of that kind of information, without the figurative lines on the field, the scoreboard, the statistics, the team standings. People don't know who the competitors are. Half the time, they don't even know what they're producing. It's a horrible situation, and then expect people to be, quote, motivated. I mean, seriously? How can you be motivated about something you don't even understand? And how can you be accountable for something and you don't even have control over? How is that even possible? You can't be accountable. How could I be held accountable when I don't even have control? I can't even make the decision about how to get the work done. So you want me to be accountable? You want me to choose commitment and accountability? Give me the control over the resources and the decision making. Give me the latitude to make those decisions. Give me the big picture so I understand how we all interface with each other to get what we understand is the final product or service that we're delivering. And I can choose accountability under those circumstances. Absolutely. Without it, it's pretty hard to do.
So Kevin, when you talk about all the things you just talked about,
yeah,
and I know we'll get to this in a few seconds. You run a turnaround program. I think it's called a 90-day turnaround. How can all of that turn around in 90 days? What should entrepreneurs do? They're listening to this episode. They're like, you know what? I'm now wondering if maybe there's some issues in my organization I haven't even really thought about.
Yeah.
What would be the first thing you do? Bring everybody in a meeting, and does anybody have an issue with this stuff? Like, what, obviously not.
Yeah.
How does your program work, and/or what do you recommend entrepreneurs do as a result of listening to this podcast? I'm going to hang up this podcast, or get off this podcast, I should say, and I'm going to go do what?
Yeah. So we have several options for people. If they feel like they can go it alone, they've got the background, the wherewithal, they can go into our self-led program, and it's a 90-day program, or they can do it faster if they want, the self-led. And they have videos we've created that explain the concepts. We have assignments to go out and carry out over what's set up as a 90-day period. So every week or two, they get a new assignment to do with their team or their organization. If they choose the cohort version, we do periodic cohort versions where we go through the program together. It's the same material, but we go through it together as a group. And I have 6 live sessions over the 90 days to help provide consulting and coaching, so that everybody has a great experience and gets over some of the bumps. And of course, we can come in and do it live and just do the work in house. But um, my goal is to really transfer my expertise to leaders so that they can do it themselves. And so if they go into this program, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to get an orientation to the leadership concepts. They're going to be critical for their success to create this kind of organization or this kind of team. And then they're going to start out with a series of 6 steps where they're going to go in and they're going to teach their team. They're going to take their team through a process of learning the context of the organization and then their connection to it, how they impact it. And there's just a series of things they'll do. They'll engage their team in analyzing the business and the work processes and improving those. And by the end of that 90 days, they've done all the critical things that we would have done with them to help their team have a completely new orientation, a completely new way of working. And they'll be more engaged. They'll be more integrated and interdependent as team members, and they're going to be operating at a higher performance level. We see routinely 20% is like a minimum performance improvement from people who go through this. So it's really a great experience.
Kevin, can you give me the number one thing that you think all business owners should know regarding the 3 things we started with, where you said what you do is you work with organizations to organize, structure, and work on leadership and to enhance their ability to do those 3 things. So if you don't mind, let me guide you through each of the 3. What's the one thing every business leader should know about organizing?
They should understand that traditionally we have had a hierarchical structure where we have organized people such that we've taken all the elements of power, the information, the knowledge, the decision-making, control of resources, and so on, and we've held them tightly at the top, and we have delegated them down to lesser and lesser degrees until we get to those who are closest to the people, closest to the work, and closest to the customer, with the least amount of those elements to be able to do the work. So in organizing, first thing, you've got to share control. You've got to learn to build the capacity of core workers so they're in the position to have that kind of knowledge and understanding that you have as a leader.
Terrific. Thank you for that. How about structure? So every business leader should know what as it relates to structure.
The broader you can, so this goes back to the last point. The more broadly you can share your leadership, your control, the more you can engage people in choosing higher levels of commitment and accountability. And so the structure would be to push responsibility out to the organization. In the past, we've always separated the managing and the doing of the work. So the leader was had the brains and the decision making, and the people had the brawn and did the work. So we have to change that. We have to integrate the managing and the doing of the work and build the capacity of employees, line workers, to manage that work themselves. So make them managers and as well as the doers.
Great. And then lastly, how about leadership, where every business leader should know what as it relates to leadership?
They should know their stance. They should understand what their stance is about people. And if they find that they have a stance where they are high control, low trust, then they should challenge their stance, challenge their beliefs about that, and in some cases simply take a leap of faith and try operating from a perspective of low control, high trust. You can't flip that switch overnight from one extreme to the other, right? You have to take your expertise and transfer that to people, and that's what our 90-day turnaround program does. Build their understanding of the big picture that we have as leaders and build their understanding of what the overall goals are of the organization and what they can do and should be doing as a team to accomplish those things.
Thank you. And then lastly, the 90-day turnaround program, how could people go about accessing that if they wanted to?
Yeah, and the 90dayturnaround.com is probably the best place to go and see the options laid out on the site there. You can also go to ascentmanagement.com, which is ASCENTMGT.com.
Very good. Thank you for your time today, Kevin. That was terrific material, and I know I benefited from it, and I know our listeners did too.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Please stick around for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down this episode.
John, it was mind-blowing to me when Kevin said, if everything is great in your organization, and that's what people say, there's a problem. If people aren't saying there's a problem, you got a big problem.
Yeah, well, listen. Hey, how's your day going? Oh, great. Typical answer you get from somebody, right? How are things today? Yeah, good. You never get someone, you're walking down the street, hey, how's everything going today? Shitty. So, hey, I think there's a human nature response that as an entrepreneur, we're proud people. So if you're going to ask me how my business is going, I'm like, yeah, it's going well. Things are going well. Things are going great, right? If a consultant is coming in and asking me how my business is going, maybe it's going even better in my mind because my ego is now a little bit stretched out.
Yeah.
But I think the point that he's trying to make is that every organization and every leader can get better. And the leaders who ascend to the top are those who are always looking to get an advantage and get better productivity out of their teams and be a better business. And I love what he talked about. Like, listen, he runs a 90-day turnaround program. You can self-lead yourself. He's basically saying you're going to get a 20% improvement in your business out of this program. Why not do this?
I love the perspective of invite what's wrong with people. Like, hey, if you can't think of anything wrong, like come up with a challenge with a concept that we just put out. Versus when, as a leader, you cast a new vision or you're trying to change direction for the better, and you rest your case on the direction you're going to head, and you hear crickets. And you ask, okay, does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any challenges? Anything we should consider? And nope. Okay, must be good. Well, Kevin says, nope, it's not must be good. Don't assume you have alignment. Actually go out of your way to invite what's wrong. Hey, everybody in the room, let's go around in a circle. Everybody needs to come up with a challenge as to why this may not work. Okay, let's just take a couple of minutes for everybody to put some thought into it, and then we'll go around. I've never done that before. What a great idea.
Yeah, but let me challenge it for a second. If you're at the point where you've launched something and you now need to bring your team together to say, okay, let's poke holes in it, isn't that a little bit, ass backwards? Shouldn't you be getting the team together going, or at least the top level part of the team and going, okay, here's what we're thinking about doing. Now poke holes in it before we launch it. But once you launch it, and you may have made this executive decision with your executive team, maybe there could be 10 people in the room, but there's 300 in the organization, and you make this decision. Do you have all the right stakeholders in the room? In that room, did you make it safe for them to challenge you? So on and so forth. But once you launch something, Rich, I think it's very difficult to go around and say, hey, everybody, let's poke holes in this new thing that we just did. We're excited about it, but everybody poke holes. That's a dangerous thing to do because they may poke a hole in something you've launched. It's all over the internet or all over your website that you're like, oh, crap, we didn't think about that.
Yeah, agreed.
So, it's easier said than done, I guess, once launched. I think what I'm trying to bring up is when you make a decision as an entrepreneur, how are you making it? And are you doing it with people that are involved? And as the business, let's forget about launch for a second. If you're running your business on an ongoing basis with no changes, how do you know when something's not going right? What's the process? And I love what he talked about in terms of entrepreneurs having biases. And both biases that he talked about, I think, are problematic. The one bias is that you have certain perceptions of your employees that, they don't know much about this or about that. And so I got to give them everything they need to do. And the opposite bias is, oh, they know what they're doing. They don't need dashboards and systems and reports. They're very dependable. They'll get the job done. And so you don't support them at all. And so you got these two biases, and maybe somewhere in between, what's the right spot? What's the right spot to make it safe, encourage very healthy conflict, very healthy conversation along the way?
Well, I'd agree with you on the point of launch. However, I still believe there's a place where doing a mid-course review and constantly practicing continuous improvement and inviting that there may be tweaks even post-launch, that there's still a place for that. I agree. At launch, you're not going to go, okay, let's have everybody come up with a problem. That's not the place to do that. But also at launch, in my world, that would be called a rollout, is at launch, right? So, but before rollout, if an entrepreneur is doing something responsibly, they will have tested it first with a very small subset of whatever it is, whether it be employees or customers or the product. It would be tested first. It would then be piloted with a little bit more challenge than the test. Then you would go to rollout. So I think at the point of test, at the concept, at the test, at the pilot, I think there are all these invitations to find problems pre-launch. So I'm sure we're in alignment on that practicing continuous improvement post-launch is still important.
Yeah. And a lot of organizations have practiced continuous improvement of some version of that in terms of the value of their company, what they want to do. And a lot of companies, Rich, also have the value of integrity somewhere in their core values. It's almost a necessity nowadays. You have to have that word in there. The problem is, are you practicing integrity if you have an issue with something I've done and you don't bring it to me? And the answer is no, you're not. You're going to the bathroom to gossip about it. You don't have the courage to come talk to me about that. That's not displaying the value of integrity. I'd say the reverse, right? If I'm the entrepreneur and I'm going to give you a safe place to articulate to me the issue you have, am I practicing integrity? And so I love that definition. Sometimes you ask people, what's the definition of integrity? Oh, don't lie, cheat, steal, do what you say you're going to do. Okay. Beyond that, though, what we're talking about here is the entrepreneur having integrity to respect his employees and his team and entrepreneurs and business people, to be vulnerable, to release control. And I love what he talked about when you asked him about organizing structure at the end. Like, the further away you are, the people that are touching the customers, the further away you are. You don't know what's going on down there. How do you shrink that org chart and broadly share leadership and control downstream? Push responsibilities down and stop creating all these middle level management that are basically pushing paper around.
Well, that speaks to another quote of his that I wrote down, which is, how do you show leadership when you're not the formal leader? So as responsibility and control is being released to people closer and closer to delivering the product or service to the end customer, how do you show leadership when you are not the formal leader of it, or you're not in control of it? And he said that was a really good question for people to ask themselves, and that he asks as a consultant. I think that's something I might like to check in on. I'd challenge you to, and our listeners, is to answer, how do you show leadership when you're not the formal leader? I think it would start off as a head scratcher and then probably gain some momentum in how we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny when you talk about that, like, Randy Soma would say there's a big difference between leadership and leadership. And if you're not creating a safe environment for your people to be open with you and share the conflicts with you and challenge you on what's going on, maybe you got a little bit of that yourself.